What if a single book could drive people to end their lives? Imagine a story so intoxicating, so painfully true to the human condition that it didn't just entertain, it infected. It seeped into the hearts of readers across Germany in the 1700s, leaving a trail of suicides and even a murder. A somewhat fictional story that touched the depths of love, jealousy, and depression so succinctly that it plagued German society in the 1700s and led to the eventual ban of the book. However tragic these events were, there's more than meets the eye when talking about this story. And in today's video, we're going on a deep dive through the terrible events that happened after this book's publishing. Society's claims that this book was to blame, the connection between real-life actions and fictional ones, the story in question, what the Werther effect truly is, the author behind this novel, what happened to the author after he published this book, and the eventual ban. This is the story of The Sorrows of Young Werther. But before we get into its tragedies, there's a question I want you to hold on to throughout this video. Can fiction really kill? I need to give a quick warning. This video explores some heavy and potentially triggering topics, including suicide, self-harm, murder, depression, and even eating disorders. If you feel any of these topics would be too much for you to handle or would impact your mental health in a negative way, I'd suggest you watch another video on my channel with more lighthearted tones. I've linked a few here and in the description. And just to clarify, The Sorrows of Young Werther isn't a story about eating disorders, but to give more context on a term that's referred to in the book, I give some more modern day examples. Now let's return to the story that haunted a nation. What drives a man to murder in the name of love? The account that someone murdered another because of the sorrows of young Werther does have its flaws, and it is a debatable topic. But later on, when we discuss the connection to suicides, I feel it's got a lot more collaborating evidence on the topic. Now, in regards to the murder, we need to go all the way back to 1779. A woman by the name of Martha Ray, mistress to the Earl of Sandwich, was leaving Covent Garden when she was shot dead on the steps by a young man named James Hackman, a soldier and disturbingly a minister of the Church of England. The motives of the killing were grey in hindsight, but the perpetrator in question claimed that he suffered from love's madness. After pulling the trigger, James Hackman followed through by trying to end his own life, but was arrested, tried for his crimes, and then hung at Tyburn 10 days later. The connection between this murder and The Sorrows of Young Werther were this. An author named Sir Herbert Croft transformed Hackman's crime into an epistolary novel titled Love and Madness. In it, he claimed that Hackman was driven by the same torment as Werther, that he saw himself as the tragic hero, and left behind writings in imitation of Werther's final lines. Imagine that, a fictional character so consumed by longing he ends his own life, mirrored by a real man who in his final moments thought he was that character. The interest in the actions that was taken out by Hackman were immense, and journalists, biographers, and historians all tried making sense of the killing. The question that still echoes centuries later is this: did Werther inspire murder? Or did it simply reveal madness that was already there? If James Hackman's murder wasn't truly inspired by Werther, then why did so many people blame this book for so many deaths? In the late 1700s, the Leipzig Theological Facility, Germany's censorship agency, called for the novel to be banned. They claimed it recommended suicide and was fueling an epidemic that was silently sweeping through Europe. But these weren't just theories. Young men across Germany used similar pistols that Werther did when he shot himself in the head, and actually wore the clothes that Werther had in his final hours, dressing in blue frock coats and buff waistcoats. There were other instances where at the scene of these suicides, there were copies of these books found, as if it was both their confessional and their justification. And it wasn't only young men. A woman named Fanny von Ickstadt jumped to her death from a tower in Frauenkirch in Munich. By the way, if I'm messing up these pronunciations, I don't speak a lick of German, so I'm very sorry. And more strikingly, a young woman drowned herself in the river Ilm behind the author's garden in Weimar. What is it about words on paper that can push someone from despair to finality? While the victims of this social contagion were many, there were many more who read the book and didn't choose the same path as Werther, either by fear, not relating to his struggles, or not relating to his reasoning. This is obviously a good thing, but even one case of relation, even one case of shared reasoning is one too many. Now, before we go deeper, I want to speak directly to you, the viewer. I just want to say that if this video sparks something within you, or you relate to the people that suffered so much that they chose to end their own life, please, for the love of all things grand in this world, all things real, talk to somebody. And if possible, even if it's hard to do, remove yourself from any environment that might be influencing this feeling within you. I personally resonated with the feelings of young Werther, not because of the same situation or in my current state of mind, but I have stood in that darkness and looked into the abyss. Even reading this book brought me back to the feelings I once had. And I just wanted you to know it's not worth it. The clouds that hang over you from your day-to-day will fade, and the sun will shine brighter than you could believe. There is hope, you are strong, and the world would be a worse place without you in it. I've attached some resources down below for any of you that feel you might need it. And if you're currently in the trenches, I would suggest you not read this book. Now let's return to the question that still lingers over the sorrows of young Werther like a storm cloud. Why was this book blamed for so many suicides? On the surface, it feels unfair. The idea that fiction could directly cause death. After all, these victims of depression were probably carrying heavy burdens long before they read this book. But that's not the whole story. Many readers didn't just see themselves in Werther. They saw a version of themselves articulated, understood, and ultimately justified. I believe they heavily related to Werther and his afflictions. Here's one of the most haunting passages I found while reading the book. A line I believe lodged itself deeply within the hearts of struggling young men and women. It is enough that the source of my wretchedness lies within myself, as the source of all my joy once did. Am I not still the very same man who once walked in an excess of happiness, paradise before him at every step, with a heart that could embrace the whole world in the fullness of love? And now that heart is dead and no longer gives me joy. My eyes are dry and my senses are not refreshed by heartfelt tears anymore, but furrow my brow with fearful worries. Werther's justification for his suicide resonated with them deeply, and might have been the final note that helped them justify their own. Werther didn't just end his own life. He explained it in a language so articulate, so emotionally precise, that it became a manual for how to intellectualize self-destruction. Another moment even more disturbing was when Werther jokingly held a pistol to his head during a conversation. The passage was this: "On this occasion he preached a veritable sermon, and finally I ceased to listen to him, fell to brooding and suddenly placed the mouth of the pistol against my forehead above my right eye. 'What rot,' said Albert, taking the pistol from me. 'What are you playing at?' 'It isn't loaded,' I said. 'Even if it isn't,' he retorted impatiently, 'what are you up to? I cannot imagine how a man can be so foolish as to shoot himself. I find the mere thought repellent. Why is it,' I demanded, 'that when people speak of things, they must promptly pronounce them foolish or clever or wicked or good? Whatever does it all mean? Have you really grasped the true and inmost nature of an action? Can you really give a definite account of the reasons why it happened and why it had to happen? If you understood them, you might not judge so hastily.'" Along with the fact that this book was found at the scene of people's own self-inflicted demise, and some of the lines in this book talking about the justification of suicide through the lens of a very intelligent and some would say well thought through man, there was a general murmur spreading amongst the population of Germany. This tension is something we still wrestle with today. when a story articulated our darkest thoughts more precisely than we can? Does it save us, or does it push us further in? The popularity of this book led to its ownership in the hands of many. Some could read the novel, find pity and compassion for the character Werther, and then move on. Others, however, read each line as if it were their own. They felt seen and understood by him. I think this is why The Sorrows of Young Werther was held tightly by those who wanted to end their own life. A book that was more than just a simple story. A book that was a mirror into the minds of the victims of this world. To truly understand why The Sorrows of Young Werther resonated so deeply with those battling with despair, we need to look at what this book is actually about. But let me ask you this first. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that it became a form of self-destruction? The blurb on the back of the book that I own describes the story as this. Visiting an idyllic German village, Werther, a sensitive and romantic young man, meets and falls in love with sweet-natured Lot. Although he realizes that Lot is to marry Albert, he is unable to subdue his passion for her, and his infatuation torments him to the point of absolute despair. The first great confessional novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, draws both on Goethe's own unrequited love for Charlotte Buff and on the death of his friend Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem. The book was an immediate success, and a cult rapidly grew up around it, resulting in numerous imitations as well as violent criticism and even suppression on the grounds of its apparent recommendation of suicide. Goethe's sensitive exploration of the mind of a young artist at odds with society and ill-equipped to cope with life is now considered the first great tragic novel of European literature. But that's the blurb, and this is what I truly think the book is about. It's a story about a young man who didn't belong. Werther was raised in wealth, but never quite fit the mold. He had a passion for nature and its ability to impact how we see the world. His exploration of the arts, both painting and language, were heavily influenced by this. Goethe tried very hard to show that Werther was an incredible, sensitive, and intelligent man. Sensitive in the way that he could notice even the smallest of detail. And he used this to build the narrative around Werther's infatuation of Lot, then his steady decline into despair. I believe this is the saddest book I have ever read, and after finishing it, I could do nothing but stare at the ceiling. I felt so strongly for Werther and his afflictions. If you choose to read it, prepare yourself. This isn't just a story, it's an experience that will haunt your thoughts long after the final page. So, can one person's death become the blueprint for another's? That's what happened after The Sorrows of Young Werther was published in the 1700s. This novel didn't just impact readers emotionally, it created a social contagion so powerful that it sparked something that we now call copycat suicide. But what exactly is copycat suicide? It's where someone emulates another person's suicide, whether they knew them personally or read about them in the news, or, like Werther's readers, experience their story through fiction. This isn't just something that's happened in history, it's also happened in more modern times too. Think back to the early 2010s, when Tumblr was at its peak. It was known for its aesthetic blogs, fandom discussions, and poetic reflections. But lurking beneath the surface was something much, much darker. There were forums of young women who were giving advice on how to get skinny by suppressing their appetite, binging and purging, cutting, and even detailed discussions about suicide. There were many instances of young women taking the advice on these blogs to heart, resonating with the people behind these posts, and eventually copying their actions. Now, I'm not saying Tumblr is ultimately responsible for what happened on their site, but in 2012, Tumblr finally took action to put a stop to what was going on. But by then, countless lives were already marked by what they read online. It's quite terrifying, isn't it? That words, whether fictional or anonymous blog posts, could have such drastic effects on those that read them. Copycat suicide has another term, one that came about because of the book in question. That term is the Werther effect. And to this day, some even prefer to use that term over copycat suicide. I think that really gives substance that a story that was written nearly 300 years ago was so impactful, so haunting, that it left its mark not just on readers, but on psychology, sociology, and history itself. So much so that a 22-year-old is making a video about it almost 300 years later, taken from an article I read while researching this topic. Dr. Nicholas Carteras wrote, "Werther fever was a classic social contagion effect. With suicides, the thinking goes something like this. When one person does something extreme, it lowers the threshold and makes it more permissible for the next person to do it. And the same for the next person and each subsequent person thereafter. And thus, with each successive suicide, it becomes more and more normative and acceptable for the next person to do it. In other words, suicide became contagious, and it all started with a piece of fiction." We've spent most of the video talking about Werther, the fictional man, but now we need to ask, who was the man behind Werther? Now this could go down two routes, either the author or someone else. I'm first going to explain the author. That man was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And his life was just as provocative, misunderstood, and emotionally charged as the characters he created. Born in 1749, Goethe lived till 1832 and left behind a legacy so profound that many describe him as, to the German language, what Shakespeare is to English. He was a poet, novelist, playwright, and scientist. He was criticized for writing about suicide, condemned for writing about souls bartered to the devil, and whispered about for his long string of romantic affairs even into his 80s. But perhaps the most haunting part about Goethe's work is this. The Sorrows of Young Werther was not entirely fictional. Before, it was but a fictional story, one of deep understanding for the depths of despair an individual can fall into, but still just a story. Then it was later noted that the character Werther was based off of a real person. Goethe remained in close letter contact with his Welser friends and was disturbed to hear a rumor at the beginning of October, which was proved unfounded, that his friend von Gogh had committed suicide. Goethe wrote back, "I hope I should never trouble my friends with news of such a kind." Not 3 weeks later, a second suicide was reported. And this time, the report was correct. On the night of the 29th of October, Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem shot himself. He died around midday on the 30th and was buried that same evening. On hearing the news at the beginning of November, Goethe immediately wrote back to Kessner. "The poor fellow. I remember returning from a walk and meeting him in the moonlight and saying to myself, he is in love. It was loneliness. God knows that ate away at his heart. I have known him for 7 years, though I talk to him seldom. When I left, I took one of his books with me, and I will keep it now and remember him as long as I live." And just like in the story, Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem was found by his servant, unable to do anything but groan, the morning after his attempt at his own life. The accounts of Jerusalem's death explained that not only did he shoot himself in the late hours of the night, but survived until the next morning in agony. I can't imagine the thoughts that would have been running through his mind if he was able to have any. These events are something that brought me to feel deeply for Jerusalem, and the story of Werther further brought me down that path. Now, how does a writer live with the knowledge that his books might have ended lives? Goethe released Werther, and following its publication received heavy criticism from his peers, society as a whole, and friends of Jerusalem. One of the harshest critics was Gotthold Lessing, a friend of Jerusalem. Lessing wrote a scathing polemic accusing Goethe of misrepresenting Jerusalem. He claimed Goethe portrayed Jerusalem as a sentimental fool, while Lessing believed he was a true reflective philosopher. Imagine that. You write a novel based on your friend's tragic death, only to be condemned for turning him into a melodramatic caricature. This criticism affected Goethe deeply. There's a debate on whether Goethe's representation of Jerusalem through the character Werther was as a sentimental fool, but nonetheless, by 1775, just a few years after Werther's publication, Goethe revised the novel and added quatrain mottos in each part. The motto at the end of part 2 urged readers to be a man and not follow Werther. He felt compelled to insert this moral warning, a plea to stop readers from repeating Werther's fate. But despite this, Goethe's reputation remained complicated. He continued to write provocative, controversial works that challenged society's moral boundaries. From Faust, from its soul-bartering protagonist, to his deeply sensual poetry. Yet the sorrows of young Werther never lost its haunting reputation. Stories of suicide connected to the book spread across Europe, and soon, governments decided they had to act. As the sorrows of young Werther spread like wildfire through Europe, reactions were polarized. On one side was Wieland, one of the preeminent writers of the time. In his 1774 review of Tootschick Merker, he argued that Goethe wasn't defending suicide. Instead, he believed the novel simply showed a soft heart and a fiery imagination can be destructive. But not everyone agreed. In fact, some people saw the novel as so dangerous that it became a matter of public health and moral order. The Leipzig Theological Facility, German censorship agency, formally applied for the book to be banned, arguing that it recommended suicide. The concern wasn't academic, it was urgent. They saw Werther not as a tragedy, but a contagion, one affecting the vulnerable minds of youth with romanticized despair. Within 2 days of their application, the city council imposed a ban. And it didn't stop there. In Denmark, plans to translate the novel were prohibited entirely. The fear was simple. If people read Werther, more would die like Werther. In total, this story was one I loved diving into head first. Like I said before, after I finished reading the novel, all I could do was stare at the ceiling for about 20 minutes, and all I felt was awe and dread, and a heavy burden was on my shoulders. If you feel you are in the right headspace to read this book, I would highly recommend you do so. It's eloquently written, the descriptions of nature and mind were so beautifully put, and the heavy tones of the story were placed so perfectly throughout the book. And if you're worried that I spoiled the book, don't be. With Werther, it's not about how the story ends. The journey throughout the story was definitely the most impactful part. Hope you enjoyed the video. I put a lot of time and effort into making this one. If you liked it, please think about leaving a comment down below and subscribe if you haven't already. And remember, if you keep seeking to be a lifelong learner, if you look at the world with nuance and minute detail, you'll be on the right path.